Welcome back, HBR. We are in our final week of the series of building resilience in children and teens. And I'm Jessica Sontek, the Director of Student Services. Joined with me today, I have Mallory Wassman, our elementary social worker, Beth Ferguson, our district psychologist, and Tara Neidig, our secondary social worker. If you're joining us for the first time, we are wrapping up this book, talking about the 7 C's of building resilience, and we have finished the 7 C's, but this week we're now talking about how as a community we can help build resilience in our kids, especially our teenage kids, as they are really in this in-between world, right, of youth and moving into adulthood, and how can we honor them and help them build some resiliency. So Dr. Ginsburg talks about, I always like to start with a little bit of his work. He says, our goal must be to create a world in which every child has the support and encouragement to develop to his potential. We can visualize that support as concentric circles, guidance, protection, and opportunity. The first and most important protective layer must be our parents' high expectations, enduring love, and unwavering support, while other protective layers include extended family, positive peers, school, and overall community. And so today we really want to spend some time asking some good sort of reflective questions with you about how do we as a school community, a civic organization community, a sports community, extended family, or even just residential community of Hinckley Big Rock, how are we supporting and building resilience, specifically for our teens?
I mean, I think we kind of chatted a little bit, but as you read that quote, Jessica, every single thing that he's talking about is really does go back to connection, mm-hmm. and having that connection with peers, schools, community. And so, out of all of those C's that we've talked about, even as you were just reading that quote, I just kept seeing that neon sign, connection.
Yeah, I think that I know that he prefaces this kind of in terms of thinking about teens, and even as we've talked about it, that seems to make more sense to be talking about how are teens connecting in our community through work or those kinds of giving back opportunities. But I think it's important as we start to talk about this that really it starts with a philosophy that begins as young as our primary grades. I talk a lot when I'm talking about like evaluation results. I'll say we need to really work to try to find the child's island of competence. What's their thing? And so I kind of wonder if we're all different and we all bring something to this, party, what are we doing as a school system to help kids identify those islands of competence? What are the things that make them excited and that make them feel more connected, or that they can offer to variety of situations, not just social, but maybe in terms of even like things that can be done around school. Mm-hmm. So I think
too, like, so we can look at this from what are we doing as a school community to help our kids identify and build on their competencies, because we know through that comes confidence, and then, the connections, all of that will eventually lead up to good resiliency skills. And then further, then as we widen that circle, what are we doing as a community across, just incorporating our residential piece? How are we supporting our kids and building competencies? We talked about kids need to contribute, right? How are we allowing our teenagers especially, but all of our kids, contribute to our culture, our community? Are we employing our teens? Are we letting them develop skills through childcare or lawn care or working in our local establishments to what is appropriate? How are we giving them a voice in, you know, things that are going to impact them. These are the ways that I think it shows our kids, especially our teens, that we are listening and what they have to say is important. And while their opinion, their vote may not be the one that is accepted, or that we end up agreeing with, just having a voice, I think that also teaches them, you know, just that civic responsibility as they hit 18 of why does my voice matter, and what goes into this. So all of these different things that we are talking about really are working to build a strong, resilient adult, right? As we've said.
And that too, I think it goes twofold, where it's are we welcoming them to the conversation? Do they feel welcomed? Just in general, when we see them, you know, or when we're engaging in conversation, you know, do they feel welcome to be a part of that conversation? And then also, it kind of goes back to what we talked about in our last podcast with control. It's almost like expanding the family meeting,
right?
So it's not so much just the, you know, in the household family meeting, it's the community family meeting. Are we giving them that voice to be a part of family?
And one of the things he did say in here that I really liked is that we can't forget that they're the experts on themselves.
Yes.
They can give us, if they can give us their ideas of what they think, you know, needs to be done in their community for them or for kids their age, that's a big deal.
Right. We often, as adults,
I really liked.
Yeah, we often try to assume we know what they need or want,
yes,
what they're going to find valuable, without asking them. And, you know, even as adults, we don't like that. We like to have some collaboration around things that matter to us. And
yes.
he talks about, and I think it's just really true, that we need to invite them into the conversation. And Mallory, you mentioned welcoming. Do they feel welcome? And I think about we want our kids to feel like they belong. We want them to be connected. We want them to have a reason to want to go places, especially school. When they walk in that door, do they feel welcome? Do they feel loved? Do they feel empowered? Do they have a connection with one or more positive adults and peers in their life that are kind of their buffers that we talked about? You know, all of those things are important. Do they feel welcome when they walk into the restaurants in town, or when they're hanging out at the park and people walk by? Do they feel respected as people? And all of those small things add up to their self-confidence and their self-worth, which also align with building that resilience. He talks about expectations in the book, and how our teens will rise or lower to whatever expectation we as schools or parents or communities place on them. What are your thoughts about that?
That was a good paragraph.
Yeah, be careful what you ask for is kind of, you know, I think it can sometimes be a little too late, you know. I think it takes courage for adults to put that out, to begin to have those conversations and put those out there. And I do think that it requires that we all sort of reflect on how we see kids and where they can get plugged in. And until we have the courage to say, you know, we really need to listen to this. This isn't just a box to check off. Okay, we asked, or we gave them a little checklist to fill out. But when kids start to see their ideas come to fruition, or where they hear their voice in policy or in programming, or, you know, whatever, that's where they're like, I thought that. I mean, we as adults feel that same way, but imagine the power. But it takes a lot of courage for an adult to do it, because that is the essence of not being able to control the outcome.
Right.
But
I
think
like we talked about last week, it would be really just be wonderful for our kids if we built the jigsaw puzzle with the frame and said, we're having a conversation that is within these these boundaries, And we want to know what you're going to do with those pieces in the middle. What would you do if this was your puzzle to attack? Like, what would you do? And what corner would you start in? Any of those things, like what's important to you within these walls, within this fence? You know, Mallory talked about, might have been off screen, the little pens, I think in our live discussion on Tuesday, but like little pens within our bigger fenced in yard, you know, and moving the gate, so to speak. But I think there's definitely a way, and you're right, Beth, it's going to take courage and confidence on our part as adults, but there's a way to include them and still have some boundaries that maintain within our control as adults, because I do think control for adults, as we talked about in our live thing on Tuesday as well, like that's often really hard for adults to release that control for kids, because it doesn't feel safe for us always either.
And I think it has to be intentional. It has to be thought about. And I think he even says, like, these messages, we're not thinking about it, or it's not intended that these messages are negative or toxic, I think is the word that he uses. Right. So instead, we then have to shift and be reflective and have conversations like we're having right now, and think about how can we, as the adults, include and be open to and release some of our control in order to allow kids to have that autonomy a little bit.
Yeah.
And I also thought, as you were bringing up too, Beth, how rewarding it would be for them to kind of see their ideas come to fruition. And I think that we have talked a lot about how we want to not so much focus on the end product for the child or student, but instead the process. But in this case, I think you're absolutely right. Let them have an end product, you know, let them have something that they can say, we did this, and really feel proud of. And also, in the meantime, be boasting their competency and their confidence, and, you know, giving them control and all of those other C's throughout the process. But, you know, giving them that opportunity to have an end, you know, tangible product.
Right?
Yeah.
At least for their time. I also think that, you know, we've just highlighted the positive ways we need to bring them in, and you know, being intentional, making sure they feel heard, welcomed, that they have the connections with the adults in the community. But then how do we utilize those connections too around the stuff that's not always so fun? And I'm talking now about, are we holding our kids accountable for their actions? Are we helping them to realize that they're responsible for their choices and things that are within their control? Are we helping them understand what is and isn't within their control? Because those are things too, and we talked about this much earlier. I think it was the week that we did talk about connections, but sometimes it's easier for our kids, or just as beneficial, to hear these messages from people outside of their parents or their immediate teacher, right? We need these positive adult connections in our kids' lives so that they're hearing these reinforcing messages from multiple people. And so as a community, are we doing that? Are we holding our kids accountable? Are we being, you know, just giving them opportunities to demonstrate responsibility? Are we setting them up for ways to develop competency across multiple skills so that their competence can improve?
I know your question is somewhat rhetorical, but I think that we have in front of us an opportunity, and you know, for people that are not part of our immediate community, we pretty much make up a big chunk of the social emotional learning team. And I think we have an opportunity to set a tone with this change, or the shift in our how we're doing school. Because one of the key pieces has to do with student engagement. And you can't just say, oh, student wasn't engaged. It's a two-way street. And so I personally think that one way to improve engagement and ultimately improve kids' sense of responsibility and onus in their learning, and and understanding how much they can get out of it by being engaged in it. But that one of the first steps that we need to do is we need to get real and genuine feedback from kids about what this experience has been like and continues to be like. And that doesn't mean asking their parents. That means taking the time to go kid by kid and do face-to-face interviews over a period of time, because they're also probably not going to have their thoughts together if we just, sat and chatted them up. And I don't really know how we do that, but I think right now, given the timing and what we don't know education is going to look like next year, that this is a way that our immediate community in school, but also with the families in our geographical community, can start to bring kids into this conversation. Mm-hmm. Almost not like, oh, wouldn't that be nice, but like have to.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point too.
So it's more than just to me whether they feel good about it, but that they, what is it to us as individuals that makes us feel like we are really accepted and seen as part of a community. It's when people reach out to us, they ask our opinion. There's, private jokes that go between, where you feel like, hey, I'm kind of in, I know what they're talking about. Do we do that? Do we provide that to our kids? Or is it the kids watching the adults create those communities and not really having a way to bridge the adult world and the student world?
And I think that's where the shift will have to be. I think when he talks about each kid, is reachable. So what do we do at school or in our communities to reach each of those kids, even the ones that don't like school, even the ones that have a tough life at home, all those kids? How do we find those things so they each have their niche? Because we can reach them all. We just have to find enough ways to do that.
Yes.
It's going to be the shift.
And what an interesting, as we've kind of experienced the new way to do school, as we were forced into this, I think we've talked about this off screen as a social emotional team within the same district, but there were children that were more accessible or more reachable than they were in the classroom in a brick and mortar. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't say in a classroom, but in true, in person. Yeah. And I think there were a couple, more so at the high school level. I think we saw a little bit more of it, but still, there were a couple fifth graders that I know for sure seemed to be much more actively engaged independently than they were engaged in the classroom setting. And not needing the teeth pulling, come on. So I think we've already kind of tapped into a way to reach some of these kids. Now we've got to fine tune and clean it up and get the engagement, and a way to assess them.
Yeah, well, and likewise, some of the kids who are high achievers and are, good, solid, they participate, they make up student council, they're athletes, they're, solid students, and they struggled to engage because the carrot disappeared, and so not just sort of saying, oh, we failed in that respect, but instead saying, well, let's dive into it a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody would want to say that your end goal is, it is, because we talk so much about grades in our society, but any parent that you talk to doesn't want it to just come down to whether they got an A or a B. They always say, we want our kids to feel confident in who they are and clear about who they could be. And ultimately, we all want them to be able to tap into that lifelong learner, that love of learning. And I think this comes a time when it gets close enough to where we see these kids who usually end up developing. I think I was one of those. I think I was a really compliant student, and I got a lot of good feedback for that. If they had suddenly, they couldn't have done remote learning because they didn't have computers when I was in elementary school or middle school. But if it had suddenly shifted and I didn't have the audience that I had, school was my audience. That was where I, thrived. How would I have engaged? What would have driven me to do what needed to be done? And they're hard questions, but I hope that, I know for myself that I'm going to be looking at ways that I can incorporate that into the work that I do moving forward.
I think that's important because you said incorporate that into the work you do. So he really talks about, this is not a one size fits all. We can't all approach this the same way, and our kids are not going to receive it all the same way. And as Tara said, every child is reachable, but not every child is going to be reachable by you or by Mallory or by me or by Tara. So we have to recognize that, and we can't say just because we didn't make a connection or we haven't been able to reach that child doesn't mean there isn't an adult out there that will, and they will. We just need to set them up for that. It could be for any reason, but if we recognize that, and we keep soliciting, keep trying to find that safe connection. And one of the other things he talks about in here is we can't give up. Kids are going to push us away. That's what teenagers do. They push adults away. And it's for a myriad of reasons. It might be because they have some trauma and there's a trust issue. It might be that they're a perfectionist and they don't really like the way that they're performing for themselves right now. Therefore, I'm going to push away because I'm not feeling good and confident. And it could be in this situation that they haven't had the high praise in the audience and the accolades that they normally would get. So it's going to be a process, but as a community, he talks about there's 2 essential questions to make sure that we're asking within our community. Do we believe every young person, do we believe in them unconditionally and hold them to high expectations? Excuse me. And do we sincerely believe that every child can succeed? If we're asking ourselves those 2 questions and we say yes, we are a community ready to build resilient kids.
Well, I think we need to ask all of us that question as we begin looking forward into next school year, and so that it frames what, at least we do. But I hope that we can continue with something like this. Yeah, different books are going to have different targets and themes, but the underlying theme is going to be the same. And that is, how are we building our toolbox to be able to make connections with kids and build that and foster that resilience. And so as we get ready to maybe do this again, that we're always thinking with that being kind of our outcome, how are we going to use this to get closer to it's not perfect, but to reach more kids and to develop those connections, those real and genuine connections.
All great stuff. If you haven't read Building Resilience in Children and Teens, highly encourage you to do so. A lot of good stuff in here. So thanks to Dr. Ginsburg for writing this and promoting it for parents and schools to use for conversation. We hope you guys have a great summer. We look forward to picking this back up in the fall. Bye.
Peace out.